Welcome to Channel 24. And please welcome Mykhailo Botsiurkiv, former spokesperson for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and now a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for being with us in our studio.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Mr. Botsiurkiv, I wanted to begin from one topic, but I think what I have to begin with, that you are staying right now in Ukraine for a long time. Please tell me your observation,
Sure.
What is going there? And as actually a foreigner with the Ukrainian roots,
Correct.
I mean, what is your motivation to stay there?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. I sensed in my bones that the full-scale Russian invasion would happen. So I actually arrived in Ukraine here in Kiev to begin with a month before the start of the war. I reference Mr. Putin's long, rambling speech. I think it was in November the previous year, in which he said, the usual bull crap, Ukraine and Russia are one, blah, blah, blah. So, all of the intelligence at the time were pointing to a full-scale invasion. I think it was Mr. Zelensky was the only one who was telling us that it's not going to happen, but it did. So here for a little bit, and then when the invasion actually happened, I was in Lviv. I stayed there a few months, and then my friends in Odessa said, come to Odessa, it'll be a different vantage point for you. And indeed it is, because of course down there we're closer to Mykolaiv and Kherson. A lot of displaced people come that way. And also we're of course, on the Black Sea. So a lot of my attention is focused on Black Sea security, of course, the port. So I concentrate a lot on the business of Ukraine. And, I never call it Odessa. I always call it World Port Odessa in my interviews. Why? Because it reminds people that Odessa is an integral part of the global food supply chain. You cut Odessa off, people in Cairo are not going to have bread to eat, and in many other countries, especially in Africa, which are on the brink of starvation. The other thing that captures my attention a lot is, of course, Moldova. It's a very small country, very weak state in the sense it doesn't have a huge military. It is really, really pounded by Russian disinformation and manipulation. Of course, it has Transnistria there and also a semi-autonomous part in the other side of the country. So they know that, God forbid, if Russian forces advance all the way to Odessa, between Odessa and Moldova border is not that far, and there are very few defenses there. Game over for them as well. So, and one more thing about Odessa, I love to brag about the place. I have fallen in love with it, and I call it Misto Heroyev as well, a city of heroes. But it's also very, very, very impressive entrepreneurialism. A lot of the business people there are very young. They're friends of mine, and they have hung on for a long time. They have stayed, and they gave it the best. But, the thing about staying here in Ukraine almost full time is you notice subtleties, you notice things between the cracks. And I do notice some of our best and brightest are leaving. They're thinking about moving their parents. They're thinking perhaps about selling long-time property because it just gets a little bit too much after a while. But having said that, I'm still seeing a lot of investment going on, a lot of innovation. We can talk about it more if you want later, but of course there's the big war going on with the aggressive states, Russia. But what I'm hearing from people as well is the war against corruption has to continue. I'll give you a quick example. I talked to some young friends. They just had a bakery that sold the best bread in Odessa. And they opened a cafe and a retail space. People go there and buy their bread. And I said, hey, you guys are doing great. Why don't you just open up in the evening, sell beer and wine? They said, we'd love to, but it takes capital, but also corruption. And we don't want to deal with it. And also, I heard the same thing from a longtime Canadian friend in Lviv who says that he's been trying to make a good go of it, and he's blocked by the city administration day after day after day. So if Ukraine wants to emerge from this war as a strong investment magnet, it also has to send out signals that it is really dealing with corruption in a strong way as well, because the war is not a pass for them to give up on all that.
Yeah, absolutely true. And I think that corruption is a huge, despite the war, it's a huge problem in Ukraine that we all have to admit it's happening.
Yeah.
And you know what, when you speak with the politicians and they are saying, listen, about the economy of Ukraine are not collapsing after more than 3 years of Russian full-scale invasion, and people would write that in the books and saying it's a miracle. Do you see that like this? Because you're saying that there are some investments and probably they will come more.
Yeah.
I hope for that.
To be honest, no. And I know, for example, the American Chamber of Commerce and others, you know, Ukraine is open for business. But let's take one issue, and that is the manpower shortage. Or as my former Prime Minister of Canada would say, human power shortage. But anyway, to be politically correct. But you go anywhere in Ukraine pretty much and you see help wanted anywhere. And you know, I'm also on the board of the East Europe Foundation, an incredible NGO that helps in all kinds of different sectors of Ukraine. And they too are having a tough time recruiting people right now. Part of that is because the UN has made the market a little bit uneven and they offer bigger salaries, so it's tougher to get people. But also, what is also complicating things right now is the cessation of USAID funding. A lot of NGOs, a lot of even business sector was dependent on them. Municipalities were dependent on them. But yeah, say, for example, if you come here with multi-million-dollar investment and want to open up a factory, I mean, good luck finding people. Also in the media sector, I talk to people like Natalia Sedlacka, who does the Schema TV program, award-winning. They have problems finding investigative journalists. We might want to talk a little bit longer about the media sector and what's happening there, but it is fits the pattern of lack of resources here in Ukraine. And then, of course, you have the other issues, war risk insurance. I wrote a New York Times op-ed a few weeks ago, and in it, I said, in order for Mr. Zelensky to take the economy a bit further during wartime, is he may want to consider easing up on martial law in the western parts of Ukraine where the war seems a bit more distant. Kind of these, what I call bubbles of normality. They even may want to look at opening up Uzhhorod and Lviv airports to civilian air traffic. People say, oh, no, it's too dangerous. But you know what? Ask the operators of Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv or in Beirut. Yes. Mm-hmm. Bring them here. They'll come to help you operate the airports. And I've talked to... I have friends at Turkish Airlines. Before the war, they flew to more domestic destinations than even the Ukrainian flight carrier. So they would love to come back here and get operations started. They said it would probably take a long time, but they fly to a lot of dangerous places too. And, when you do these sorts of things, they send a signal to the international community that, yeah, okay, maybe it's time to reconsider coming into Ukraine. Again, there is that still perception of corruption here. But I think, sadly, there's no sign to the end of the war. The government has to become more innovative. It takes more than slogans to get people back in here.
Well, I have 2 points here.
Sure.
One, when I'm usually going to Davos conference every year for the last maybe...
I've never been. They never invited me.
Oh. So sorry for that. I mean,
no worries.
But the thing is, every time, lots of businessmen from the United States, Europe, and different parts of the world, they're, convincing you that they are ready to invest in Ukraine, whether it was 2022, 2023, and 2024. They are saying, we are ready. We know you have a safer part of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And nobody are pushing them to say that. So you think they're just stopping because of the corruption, right?
I think that's the main reason. Of course, let me give you another example. The Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and others have talked about the so-called coalition of the winning and getting a so-called protection force in here. As you pointed out in the introduction, I was part of the OSCE. Now, we paid good salaries. We found people from neighboring states that are really brave to come here. But if you're talking about the huge numbers of protective force or observers that President Zelensky is talking about, it's going to be tough to get people here because of the threat perception level that currently exists. But I think also, the other problems here are there's an inflation going on. There's infrastructure problems, of course. And I think if the government was a little bit more transparent in terms of not just saying Ukraine's open for business all the time, but this is what we need to deal with. And in addition to that, we're going to have, I remember before the war, they were talking about, the Ukrainian word, nyanya, the people, the business partners that would help you be kind of a partner with you here, like a concierge to help you come in here. Innovative things like that need to be done. One more quick thing. Of course, some of Ukraine's best and brightest have left in huge numbers. There are millions of Ukrainians overseas right now. We also have to recognize the fact that a lot of them may not come back right away, if at all. But how does Ukraine, as a state, utilize them as a strong part of their diaspora, maybe as ambassadors, but maybe also, I mentioned the media sector. Why don't we think about, Ukrainian media in exile, putting a big newsroom up in Europe, getting all these journalists who are there right now, who a lot of them are not even working.
I completely support that idea.
Not working in the field right now, and get our message out, work with other media in exile groups, whether it be from Belarus or from Russia or from Afghanistan. We all have many of the same concerns. And then finally on that point, we have the URC coming up in Rome next month. At all of the reform or reconstruction conferences, whatever they call them now, media has never come up once. It's never been an official part of the agenda. And the reason I mention this, because it goes back to what we're talking about, if you want business people to have a serious look at Ukraine, they require two things. They require a viable media presence here on the ground to act as a check against corruption, like Zelensky's program does Kremlin and Ukrainska Pravda, but they also need very, trustworthy information about what's going on the ground. And if you don't have those two components, it's going to be very difficult to attract investment here. Okay,
I would love to add one point. When I was in Brussels last year, and I was speaking with a lot of, European diplomats, and they said that, what's at least one thing good, not about the corruption, but about the cases that we know. It's good that those cases becoming public, because it's much worse when it's happening and nobody's talking about that. So at least that's the point I wanted to say to you as something that probably...
Yeah, and by the way, there was a case of a very prominent Ukrainian-Canadian businessman who came here. Again, it was pre-war, and he wanted to put up a power station with solar power station. And then the oligarchs at the time got a wind of what he was doing and all the money he was making. And guess what? They pushed him out by declaring the property that not his and all these kind of tricks and everything. These types of incidents stay in the memory for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just shift a bit on another topic. Recently, there was an interview of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to ABC News, where he said that Ukraine have done a lot to agree for a ceasefire initiative, and including all the proposals from the Trump administration, while Russia denied all of them. From your perspective, what does it tell to the world about Moscow, wider pictures and true agenda?
Yeah. Well, first of all, of course, Russia has no interest in peace right now. They want to grab as much territory as possible. They want to level Ukrainian cities, towns, and villages. And I'm very concerned about Kharkiv right now, what's happening there. And the reason they've escalated right now, I think, is because there's a void. There are no red lines that previously existed that are being enforced by the United States. There are only gray lines right now. And autocrats like Mr. Putin love that, because then they can push and push and push. The other thing right now, and this was in discussion a lot at last weekend at Mr. Goncharenko's Black Sea Security Forum, is that there's also even doubt on whether, last night there were strikes close to the Polish border. If one hit in Poland in a big way, because there have been minor explosions there, would NATO mobilize? Attack on one is attack on all. That's a good question. And there's doubt whether that will happen. There was even talk last weekend about, God forbid, Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons in a small part of the battle zone, what would be Europe's response? So it's a very complex time right now. Now, it is difficult for Ukraine right now because America is backing away. And what Trump said the other day is totally irresponsible. Oh, this is just like two kids fighting in the schoolyard, let them fight a bit longer. That is no deterrence to President Putin. In fact, I think it encourages him. But the talks in Istanbul, although the not that much was achieved, I am glad the Turks are taking the part of the United States, because what we saw from the U.S. and their behavior in Saudi Arabia when they met with the Russians and Ukrainians, very transactional. They're trying to get the most out of this as possible. If you ask me about what Mr. Trump's motivations are, I think there are two. And this is why I'm glad they're backing away. One is that he wants to, of course, make as much money as possible out of this in terms of whatever he does. And then the second thing is he thinks Russia is some huge economy. If only we normalize relations between Russia and the United States, they're going to come and open factories. Well, I'm sorry about right now, Russia is, if you're lucky, the size of the economy of the Netherlands. They're growing at a very, very small GDP rate, whereas you look at Poland, they're the ones really on the upward trajectory. If Mr. Trump wanted to make economic deals, he should do it with Poland. But the Turks, of course, they have a huge interest in Black Sea security. They've been at this at a long time. They basically ran the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. I mentioned Turkish Airlines. There are a lot of other Turkish firms that are involved here. They've been involved in drone production as well. And the most important thing is that Mr. Erdogan has Mr. Putin and Mr. Zelensky on speed dial. Both of them will pick up his phone call. That is very important. And the Turks, again, having worked with them, and I've seen them in action in disaster zones around the world as well, is they don't go into something unless there's going to be an achievable result. They're very, very pragmatic. So they will, I think, steer things the way that we will have some sort of positive outcome. The Americans, Europeans are on the sidelines a little bit watching all of this. But one more thing, of course, which Ukraine cannot do without U.S. participation is the military aid and the intelligence sharing. If that were to be switched off, God forbid, say tomorrow, it could be game over for Ukraine, because Europe, as we know, is in no position after years and years and years of neglect to come in and replace the United States in terms of military muscle and intelligence.
Do you see the picture when Zelensky and Putin will meet with each other in person?
You know, stranger things have happened. If we go back to Oslo and how the Israelis and the Palestinians, after, legendary hatred towards each other, what happened there is it started at a very low level, trust-building initiatives, and then it went up and up and up, and finally the deal was signed in the United States. So I think what happens in this business, we saw the prisoner exchanges, and I know the one happening as we speak still, I believe, is not exactly what everyone thought would happen. But these are confidence-building measures, because what needs to happen in operations like that, they're very complex. And by the way, during the OSCE SMM time in 2014, 2015, we had 3 groups of colleagues kidnapped. And I
remember that case.
That's
yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
And that transfer had to happen. So guns need to fall silent temporarily. Mechanics need to be worked out, synchronization, and there has to be a little bit of trust, because they're handing something over and Ukraine is handing something back in return. So the more those things happen, I think it could ease the way to a peace agreement. But of course, having said that, you can't trust the Russians. And the game they're playing right now is straight out of the Kremlin playbook, is that you stretch things out as long as possible. And then you also, what you do is you present maximalist demands. Okay, we want all of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk. We want
that are not theirs, actually.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, we want U.S. or international recognition of Crimea. We want Ukraine to reduce its armed forces. We want them to back away from NATO, possibly EU membership. I mean, these are all conditions that are ridiculous and that no Ukrainian president could agree to.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it looks a little bit bleak right now, I gotta say. Of course, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. The longer this continues, I mean, remember COVID, how scary it was at the beginning, that we couldn't see an end to it, and it made people very, very nervous and uneasy, and it was very, very difficult to plan whether a wedding or a big investment. And from many Ukrainians I talk to, there is this fatigue. They're not giving up hope, and they're never going to accept Russian occupation. But there is a fatigue setting in that makes life, of course, very difficult.
Yeah, because the only people that could talk about fatigue, that probably Ukrainians,
exactly.
Especially living on eastern Ukraine and eastern South Ukraine.
Yeah.
And yes, absolutely. But you know, when we talk about the United States involvement in all of this, I recall that just a recent interview of former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmytro Kuleba. And
I'm a big fan.
Yes.
Full disclosure, and
you're not alone
All
here.
Right.
So, and what he said, because now he's not kind of on the position, so
right.
he could speak freely, So, my point is, he said that probably it would be better if the United States will step up from all this process of negotiation, not helping Ukraine, not of the process of helping Ukraine, imposing sanctions against Russia, tough and strong as they are promising, but just to step back. What do you think? Is that a scenario right now?
Before I answer that, let me give you a little diplomatic subtlety that I observed right before Mr. Kuleba was either pushed away or stepped away. I remember in his last weeks as foreign minister, and that included a trip to Beijing, he was back into his dapper self, where these things, but he looked great. He stepped out of the kind of camouflage uniform that the whole Zelensky circle was wearing, and I thought to myself, something here is different. And then, of course, he did move on, step out of the position at the ministry. And I know I'm friends with a lot of Ukrainian diplomats and ambassadors, and they miss him very, very much. But in terms of what the United States should do right now, of course, you see, I think the core of the problem there is that Mr. Trump, I mean, he doesn't even understand economic theory. Look what he's doing with the tariff war. But secondly, the MAGA base and ordinary Americans, and a lot of people in the West, for that matter, don't realize that, I'm not saying anything new here, is that this war, if Mr. Putin is not stopped, he will continue further. I mean, I was shocked last weekend at the Black Sea Security Forum when people gave us very, very specific examples of Russia's hybrid warfare and how they're carrying on. It isn't only cable cutting in the Black Sea, it's cable cutting using Chinese civilian ships, sometimes with Russian crew on board, to kind of camouflage this activity. And then, you also have the friends of Russia in Tehran and Pyongyang and Beijing helping them. And then you also have a problem, for example, with the Russians being able to get their hands on new technology somehow and build mini submarines and then try to smuggle them through the Bosphorus Straits on civilian ships. Europe should be on, 10 alarm stage in terms of the threat from Russia right now. They're well known for neutralizing opponents on foreign soil, whether it's in the United Kingdom or whether it's in Spain, meddling in elections, doing all kinds of problems with infrastructure, spying. So if they are not pushed back and pushed back hard, they will go further. And remember, war these days are not just waged with tanks and airplanes, even less so, by high technology, by disabling massive infrastructure. So, but that message has not gone down to the MAGA base of which Mr. Trump is the leader. And whenever I talk to Americans, they don't realize, and I mentioned again, World Port Odessa, that, hey, boyfriends and girlfriends, if Odessa port, if Ukraine is unable to export its grain and its sunflower oil, your grocery bill is going to get higher. That's what they have to be told. And then they kind of understand things. That's what we did in Canada when Trump said, oh, we're going to annex you. Said,
and what we have now.
Yeah, and then with tariffs. And then, thank God to our premiers, Premier Ford of Ontario said, okay, if you guys want to do that, we're going to cut off electricity to northern states. And then they came to their senses. And also the province of Alberta or Texas, you know, they could cut off oil, and it's going to really, really hurt. So it's a very complex set of dynamics right now, but I think, and I think the same thing for some of the electorate in the European states. Why is it that we're on the 17th European sanction package? Why wasn't all that done at the beginning to really push back Mr. Putin? So enough talk, enough coming to Kiev, taking selfies with President Zelensky. This is what I hear from a lot of Ukrainians. Do this, really, really tighten that noose so that the pain is really felt in the Kremlin.
You know, when I was at one of the conferences happening in Ukraine recently, maybe a few months ago, and there was a soldier, he was without one arm, wounded on the front line. And he was saying, listen, Europe is reminding me as like a little kid, and it's waking up for 5 minutes. It's like doing some actions, but going to school. I mean, the kid that are waking up to go to school. And then he asking the parents, I need 5 or more minutes, and falling asleep again. And then waking up and falling asleep.
Yeah, pretty much.
Pretty much, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, I'll give you another example. At the Black Sea Security Forum, the deputy head of the EU mission here in Ukraine, I forget his name, but anyway, he was asked point blank about, are you prepared, is the EU prepared to use not the interest, but the principle of that 180 or 90 billion euros to help Ukraine buy new ammunition? Or if you don't want to do that, put it in a Reconstruction fund. Because that's the other thing the Russians said, by the way, we're not paying reparations. And instead of answering the question, he totally ignored it. And instead he commented on other panelist presentations. And he said, and yeah, we've given millions and millions away in windfall profits from these frozen Russian assets. And thank God to Ivanka Tsintsadze. She said to him, no, you're not going to get away with it. We need that money now to go towards weapons, especially when the United States is backing away. But they just don't have the fortitude in Brussels to do that. They're too concerned about what it would do to the reputation of the EU and to the euro. But again, okay, if you don't want to do that, be ready for Russia to cause even more havoc closer to Europe. And if that doesn't happen, what could happen, by the way, on Friday, I was at the East Europe Foundation, and full disclosure, I'm a board member, but I learned there that listen, Europe, if the intensive Russian summer offensive happens all the way to the max, we could see a displacement of more than 200,000 Ukrainians from eastern parts of Ukraine, and the front line could move as much as 60 kilometers. Now, those 250,000 displaced people are not just going to stay in Ukraine. They will want to go to safer high ground into Europe. That's why neighboring EU states need to listen up and say, okay, yes, we need to do something to help Ukraine push Russia back.
Yeah, absolutely true. When I'm opening right now international media, and some of the columnists of Wall Street Journal, he said that it's very sad, true, that Russia now, they are not winning on the front line. They cannot hold the part of Ukraine for years, to be honest. So, but still, they're giving a picture of a winner to the world. And you know what, Mykhailo, it works. When I'm opening the news and I see, have you seen yesterday that Germany are trying to check all the bomb shelters, all the 2,000 bomb shelters they have, whether they are functioning well for people to hide in case Russia will attack. So despite the fact that you will increase weaponry supplies to Ukraine, you are checking the bomb shelters. France, at the same time, trying to increase their investments into the defense sector. And I mean, it's don't you see that it's kind of a surreal picture happening? It
is. And, you know, I remember being in a panel in London at the Conduit Club I think it was Victor Mallet from the FT, and he said at the time, and again, this was 2 or 3 years ago, that the United Kingdom should be on a war footing now, considering what's happening in Ukraine, and that never happened. Now, of course, what's happening in the background as well is that there are competing demands, and I see this in my own country, in Canada, because Yulia Kovalyov, your great ambassador there to Canada, has said many times on air, you guys have to start thinking of Arctic security because Russia is not that far away when you think about it. But, you know, our healthcare system in Canada is falling apart. We have a housing crisis. A lot of the Ukrainian migrants who came for safe haven cannot find proper accommodation. Similar things are happening in the United Kingdom and other states. So there are competing demands, but you know what? If you don't address this issue as well and reallocate scarce funds to defense, to especially fighting the Russian hybrid war, there's going to be a lot of trouble right on your doorstep.
Well, I don't know whether they understand. And actually, all this coalition of the willing, I had so much hope for that. And I remember I had the interview with the Austrian expert, Tom Cooper. I love how he's an analyst, war expert. So, and he said, all they can do is just talking and talking.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, probably they will act finally. And now what we see, they are just talking. And
yeah. You know, I wrote in a CNN op-ed last year, Erin Burnett repeated it on her show to Samantha Power at the time, and the key line there was, nothing stops Russian missiles. Sorry, words don't stop Russian missiles the way Patriots do. So enough talking. Give Ukraine the Patriot missiles, the anti-defense systems to protect Ukrainian cities. Now, it has to be recognized. I mean, Ukraine is more or less the size of France. It's a big area. It isn't Israel. Israel is the size of New Jersey, much easier to protect. So it takes a lot of firepower. And I've noticed, for example, the past week on Odessa, when I'm there, of course, I'm not going to say exactly where I live, but it is pretty central. And for the first time, I heard what you guys are used to, the drones buzzing right overhead.
all the time.
A few weeks or months ago, I never heard that because they would shoot them down over the water. But what that indicates to me is there isn't the wall. And of course, the Russians are striking with bigger density, with smarter drones, with decoy drones, things like that. But once again, if that port is destroyed, if, you know, also the other parts of the port on the Dniester River closer to Moldova and stuff like that, it's going to cause huge follow-on problems to the world economy, especially food.
Do you believe there is any force, power in this world that could stop Putin? I'm thinking about that every day.
Yeah. Well, I thought about this a lot the past couple of times I've been in Asia in the past few months. And what I saw there was pretty shocking, is that if you go, well, actually, first I was in the UAE, and you see that Russians are one of the biggest purchasers, if not the biggest purchasers of luxury property there. The oligarchs park their yachts there. They're partying like there's no tomorrow. And then you go to Thailand, and there are probably hundreds of thousands of Russians there. If they're not visiting, they're actually living and staying there. They've even taken over certain parts of the economy. So the reason I bring this up is that if you cut off, and now it is going to be painful for countries like Thailand because their tourism has gone way down recently, but if you cut off Russian access, the ordinary people or the wealthy people to visiting Thailand, Turkey, UAE at once, but at the same time, you also cut off, for example, Thailand along with Gabon in Africa and I believe the UAE have become hubs for export of aviation parts. Before they had zero or very little of that. And where do these parts go? To Russia. So you have to get these countries as well to close off those back doors to Russia. It will be very difficult because it would also probably have to involve India. And I've been to India recently, and they explained to me how they like to be neutral. And also China is the biggest purchaser of Russian oil right now. So my point here is two things. You have to cut off the money that supplies the war machine, but you also have to tighten the noose especially of the people around Putin's inner circle. And then that will put pressure on him to say, okay, game over. One last thing, because I hate to leave things on a depressing tone, but, you know, I said this on BBC the other day. What happened when Ukraine did that incredible invasion into Kursk last summer, but then also the most recent audacious attack on Spiderweb and then the bridge, Kerch Bridge. You know, not all of that adds up. There's something here that doesn't meet the eye, especially with the invasion last summer where Ukrainians basically walked over the Russian border. That, to me, indicates some sort of insubordination or incompetence at the highest level. If I'm right, that should give Ukrainians even more hope that Putin's, you know, facade of strength and unity isn't exactly all it looks to be.
Mykhailo, thank you so much for such a deep conversation, and I hope I'm going to see you again in our studio in a while.
I hope so too. Thank you for having me.